She walked into Judge Judy's courtroom with tears streaming down her face, clutching a worn photograph of two small children, her voice trembling as she told the judge about losing everything. The courtroom fell silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that only comes when everyone believes they're witnessing genuine pain. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying the woman before her, while the bailiff stood at attention, sensing something in the air that didn't quite fit. The plaintiff, a middle-aged landlord named Richard Torres, sat rigid in his seat, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. This wasn't just another small claims case over unpaid rent. This was about to become something far more twisted, far more shocking than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The defendant, Jessica Harmon, a 32-year-old single mother, stood at the podium with her shoulders hunched forward, her eyes red and swollen, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden stand, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, the picture of a woman who'd been beaten down by life's cruelest blows. Richard was suing her for $8,300 in unpaid rent, property damage, and stolen belongings from the apartment she'd rented from him for nearly 2 years. But Jessica wasn't just defending herself. She was countersuing for $12,000, claiming Richard had illegally evicted her, destroyed her personal belongings, and caused her children severe emotional trauma by throwing their possessions onto the street in the middle of winter. The audience, a mix of curious onlookers and daytime television faithful, shifted in their seats, their faces already showing signs of sympathy for Jessica. A woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man near the back shook his head slowly, his expression one of quiet outrage at the landlord. Judge Judy's courtroom had seen thousands of cases, but there was something about a struggling mother, about children caught in the crossfire, that always hit different. Jessica knew this. She was counting on it. Judge Judy adjusted her glasses, her fingers drumming once on the bench before she spoke, her voice carrying that signature blend of authority and skepticism that had made her a legend. "Ms. Harmon," she began, her eyes locked onto Jessica's face like a laser sight. "You're telling me that Mr. Torres here threw you and your 2 children out onto the street in February, in freezing temperatures with all your belongings, and you had nowhere to go?" Jessica nodded, her lower lip quivering as she clutched the photograph tighter. "Yes, Your Honor. My daughter, she's only 7, and my son just turned 5. They watched their toys, their clothes, everything we owned, get thrown into garbage bags and tossed onto the sidewalk like trash. We had to sleep in my car for 3 nights before my sister could take us in." The courtroom let out a collective gasp, soft but audible, the kind of sound that comes from people who believe they're witnessing an injustice. Richard's face reddened, his hands balling into fists on his lap as he shook his head vigorously. Judge Judy raised one hand, silencing him without a word, her attention still fixed on Jessica. "And you're saying this happened because you couldn't pay rent?" Jessica's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear her. "I lost my job, Your Honor. I worked at a call center and they let me go without warning. I tried to explain to Mr. Torres, I begged him to give me time, but he wouldn't listen. He said if I didn't have the money by the end of the month, I was out. And then 2 days before the deadline, he just showed up with his brother and started throwing our things out." Judge Judy's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. That microscopic shift that anyone who'd watched her show knew meant the wheels in her mind were already turning. She glanced down at the case file in front of her, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness, then looked up at Richard. "Mr. Torres, you're the landlord. You've been doing this for how long?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady but tight with barely controlled frustration. 23 years, Your Honor. I own 4 rental properties in the area and I've never, not once, illegally evicted anyone." "This woman is lying." The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine shock and hurt. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice cracking. "Why would I lie about something like this? My children were traumatized. They still have nightmares." Judge Judy held up her hand again, her voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade through silk. "Ms. Harmon, let me ask you something very simple. When exactly did this eviction happen? What was the date?" Jessica blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if the question had caught her off guard. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day. I remember because my daughter had made cards at school, and they got ruined when everything was thrown outside." Judge Judy nodded slowly, her pen tapping against the bench in a rhythm that somehow felt ominous. "February 14th. And you said you slept in your car for 3 nights before your sister took you in? Jessica nodded eagerly. Yes, Your Honor. It was the worst 3 days of our lives. Judge Judy leaned forward, her elbows resting on the bench, her fingers steepled in front of her face. That's interesting, she said, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that anyone familiar with her show knew meant someone was about to get destroyed. Because according to the documents Mr. Torres provided, including photographs with timestamps, text messages, and a police report, something about your story doesn't quite add up. The courtroom went still, the kind of stillness that comes right before an earthquake. Jessica's face, which had been a mask of grief and desperation moments before, flickered for just a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, just a tiny crack in the facade, but Judge Judy saw it, the audience saw it, and the cameras caught every microsecond of it. Jessica's grip on the photograph tightened, her knuckles going white. I don't understand, Your Honor. What are you saying? Judge Judy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a folder from beneath her bench. The kind of deliberate theatrical move that she'd perfected over decades on television, and placed it on top of the case file. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents before she looked back up at Jessica, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd already solved the puzzle and was just waiting for the other person to realize they'd lost. What I'm saying, Ms. Harmon, is that you walked into my courtroom with a very compelling story, a story designed to make everyone here feel sorry for you, to paint Mr. Torres as a heartless villain, and to walk out of here with his money in your pocket. Jessica's eyes darted to the folder, then back to Judge Judy's face, and for the first time, the trembling in her hands looked less like grief and more like fear. But here's the problem with lies, Ms. Harmon. They only work if no one checks the facts. And I always check the facts. The audience leaned forward as one, their earlier sympathy beginning to curdle into suspicion. Richard sat up straighter, his expression shifting from frustration to something close to vindication. And Jessica, the woman who'd walked in looking like a victim, now stood frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed story beginning to crumble before a single piece of evidence had even been presented. Judge Judy closed the folder and looked directly into Jessica's eyes. So let me ask you again, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did Richard Torres illegally evict you and your children on February 14th? Or is there something you're not telling this court? The question hung in the air like a noose, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. This wasn't just a case about unpaid rent. This was about to become an exposé of deception so calculated, so brazen, that it would leave the entire courtroom speechless. And it all started with one woman's tears and one judge's refusal to be fooled. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes flickering between Judge Judy and the folder on the bench like a trapped animal searching for an escape route. Your Honor, I'm telling the truth. I swear on my children's lives. Judge Judy's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Don't swear on your children's lives in my courtroom. Answer the question. Before Jessica could respond, Judge Judy turned her attention to Richard Torres, her voice shifting to that businesslike tone that meant she was building her case brick by brick. Mr. Torres, walk me through what actually happened. Start from the beginning. Richard straightened in his seat, relief washing over his features as he finally got his chance to speak. Your Honor, Jessica moved into my property in March of 2023. For the first 6 months, everything was fine. Rent was on time, no complaints, no issues. Then in September, the payments started coming late. First by a few days, then a week, then 2 weeks. I was patient because she told me she was having trouble at work. He paused, pulling out a stack of text messages from his folder, his hands surprisingly steady for a man who'd been accused of such cruelty. I have all the text exchanges right here. I gave her extensions, I worked with her, I even reduced the rent by $200 a month for 3 months to help her get back on her feet. The audience stirred, their earlier sympathy for Jessica beginning to waver as the first cracks in her story appeared. Judge Judy took the text messages, her eyes scanning them with the practiced speed of someone who'd read thousands of similar documents. So you weren't the heartless landlord throwing a struggling mother onto the street? Richard shook his head firmly. No, Your Honor, I have 3 daughters of my own. I would never do something like that to children. Judge Judy looked up from the text, her gaze sharp. Then what changed? Why are we here? Richard's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, there was an edge of betrayal in his voice. In January, she stopped paying rent entirely. Wouldn't return my calls, wouldn't answer texts. When I finally went to the property to check on things, I found out she'd moved out 3 weeks earlier. Didn't tell me, didn't return the keys, just disappeared. And when I got inside, Your Honor, the place was destroyed. Holes in the walls, carpets ruined, appliances missing. My dishwasher, my microwave, even the ceiling fans were gone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, heads turning toward Jessica, whose face had gone pale. Judge Judy held up her hand for silence, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. "You have proof of this?" Richard nodded, pulling out his phone. "I have photographs, Your Honor. Dated and time-stamped from January 28th, more than 2 weeks before she claims I evicted her." Judge Judy took the phone, swiping through the images, and even from her elevated position, the audience could see her eyebrows rise slightly. She looked at Jessica, and the courtroom held its breath. "Ms. Harmon, these photos show an empty, damaged apartment. They're dated January 28th. You claim you were evicted February 14th. Would you like to explain that?" Jessica's hands trembled as she gripped the podium, her eyes darting frantically as if searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. "Those photos, they must be from a different time, Your Honor. He's trying to confuse the dates to make me look bad." Judge Judy's eyes narrowed to slits, her voice dropping to that deadly calm that sent chills through the courtroom. "A different time? Ms. Harmon, these photos have metadata. Do you know what metadata is?" Jessica nodded weakly, her earlier tears now seemingly dried up, replaced by a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead. "Yes, but technology can be wrong, Your Honor." Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Technology can be wrong. That's your defense?" She picked up another document from the folder, holding it up so Jessica could see it. "This is a police report filed by Mr. Torres on January 30th. 2 officers went to the property to document the damage. They noted in their report that the apartment had been vacant for at least 2 weeks based on the mail piled up and the condition of the property. The officers' names are right here. Badge numbers, everything." The courtroom gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like air being sucked out of the room. Jessica's face went from pale to ashen, her lips parting but no words coming out. A woman in the audience whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Oh my God, she's lying." Judge Judy raised one finger, silencing the murmurs without even looking at the crowd. "I'm not done. Ms. Harmon, where were you on January 28th? Jessica's voice came out as barely a whisper. I don't remember exactly." Judge Judy's response was immediate and cutting. "You don't remember? Try harder." Jessica's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked different, desperate rather than sorrowful, the tears of someone watching their carefully constructed lie collapse in real time. "Your Honor, I'm confused about the dates. It's been so traumatic that everything blurs together. The important thing is that my children and I suffered." Judge Judy removed her glasses in one swift motion, the gesture so deliberate and practiced that everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. "Stop, just stop talking." The words came out like bullets, each one hitting its mark with precision. "You're not confused about dates, Ms. Harmon. You're caught in a lie. And now you're scrambling." Judge Judy stood up from her chair, something she rarely did, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She walked to the edge of the bench, looking down at Jessica with an expression that mixed disappointment with barely contained fury. "I want to show you something else." She pulled out another document, this one looking official with a gold seal visible even from a distance. "This is a lease agreement for a different property, an apartment complex in Riverside. Do you know whose name is on this lease?" Jessica's face went completely white, all the color draining away as if someone had pulled a plug. I don't know what you're talking about." Judge Judy's voice rose, filling every corner of the courtroom with its power. "Your name, Ms. Harmon? Your signature is right here, dated January 15th. 2 weeks before you claim you were illegally evicted and sleeping in your car with your children." The courtroom erupted. Gasps turned into exclamations, heads whipping around to look at Jessica, whose legs seemed to buckle slightly at the podium. The bailiff took a subtle step closer, ready to intervene if needed. Richard Torres sat in his chair with his mouth hanging open, his hands gripping the armrests as if the revelation had physically knocked him back. Judge Judy wasn't finished. She walked back to her seat but remained standing, her voice now carrying a tone of cold revelation. "You moved out of Mr. Torres's property in early January. You took his appliances and sold them, which I have proof of from 3 different pawn shops. You moved into a new apartment in Riverside with your boyfriend, a man named Derek Chen, whose name is also on this lease. And then, after you'd already abandoned the property and destroyed it, you came up with this elaborate story about being thrown out on Valentine's Day with your crying children to avoid paying what you owe and to extort more money from a man who showed you nothing but patience." Jessica's shoulders began to shake, but these weren't the theatrical sobs from earlier. These were the tremors of someone whose entire scheme had just been dismantled piece by piece in front of a national television audience. Judge Judy sat back down, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Look at me. Look at me." Jessica slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting Judge Judy's, and in that moment, The entire courtroom saw the mask finally slip completely. Did you or did you not fabricate this entire story about being illegally evicted? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, Jessica whispered, "Yes." Judge Judy's face transformed into an expression of pure, controlled rage, the kind that comes from someone who's seen every type of deception imaginable, but still finds herself surprised by human audacity. She placed both hands flat on the bench, leaning forward with an intensity that made even the cameramen take a step back. In 30 years on this bench, I have seen liars. I have seen con artists. I have seen people who would say anything to avoid responsibility. But you, Ms. Harmon, you are in a category all your own. Her voice grew louder with each word, filling the courtroom like thunder. You didn't just lie about money. You didn't just lie about property damage. You weaponized your children. You used those babies as props in your con game, claiming they were traumatized, that they had nightmares, that they watched their belongings thrown into the street like garbage. The audience sat frozen, some with their hands covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disgust. Jessica stood at the podium with her head bowed, tears streaming down her face, but no one in that courtroom felt an ounce of sympathy anymore. Judge Judy picked up her gavel but didn't strike it yet, instead pointing it at Jessica like a weapon. You came into my courtroom with a photograph of your children, crying fake tears, playing the role of a desperate mother, all while you were living comfortably in a new apartment with your boyfriend. You stole from Mr. Torres, destroyed his property, and then had the audacity to sue him for $12,000. Judge Judy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Richard Torres. You will pay him $8,300 for unpaid rent and property damage. Your countersuit is dismissed with prejudice, which means you can never bring this nonsense claim again. But more than that, Ms. Harmon, I want you to understand something. She leaned even closer, her eyes boring into Jessica's. You didn't just lie to me. You lied to every struggling single mother out there who really does face hardship, who really does worry about keeping a roof over their children's heads. You made their legitimate struggles look like lies. You made it harder for real victims to be believed, and for that you should be ashamed. Judge Judy raised her gavel high. Case dismissed. Get out of my courtroom. The gavel struck with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, final and absolute. Jessica turned from the podium, her shoulders hunched, her face buried in her hands as she stumbled toward the exit. The courtroom remained silent, watching her retreat like spectators at an execution. Richard Torres sat motionless, his eyes glistening with tears, not of sadness but of vindication. The relief of a man who'd been branded a villain and finally had his name cleared. The bailiff opened the door and Jessica disappeared through it, but her humiliation was only beginning. Outside the courtroom, the hallway cameras caught her leaning against the wall, hyperventilating while her attorney tried desperately to calm her down. She had no statement, no excuse, just the hollow look of someone who'd gambled everything and lost spectacularly. But the story went deeper than anyone in that courtroom initially realized. Judge Judy's producers had done extensive background research, and what they uncovered painted an even darker picture. This wasn't Jessica's first attempt at this scheme. Court records revealed she'd sued 2 previous landlords in different counties with nearly identical stories, claiming illegal evictions, traumatized children, and destroyed belongings. One case had been settled out of court for $3,000. Another had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the landlord had been so exhausted by the process, he'd simply walked away. Jessica had perfected her con over years, targeting small-time landlords who couldn't afford lengthy legal battles, using her children's faces and manufactured tears as weapons. Richard wasn't just a random victim. He was landlord number 4 in her pattern of deception. Investigation also revealed that Derek Chen, her boyfriend whose name appeared on the Riverside lease, had a criminal record for fraud and identity theft. The two had been running a coordinated operation, moving from property to property, extracting settlements or stealing appliances to resell. Local authorities, now armed with Judge Judy's televised evidence, opened an investigation into Jessica's activities. Charges of fraud, theft, and perjury were being prepared. The lesson from Jessica Harmon's downfall echoes far beyond Judge Judy's courtroom, reaching into the heart of why truth matters in a world where deception seems easier than honesty. In an age where a sympathetic story and a few tears can manipulate emotions, where social media mobs form before facts are checked, where victims are believed without question and accused are condemned without trial, this case stands as a stark reminder that reality always has a way of surfacing. Judge Judy's courtroom proved something fundamental. Lies may start strong, but they collapse under the weight of evidence, and the fall is always harder than anyone expects. Here's what makes Jessica's deception so dangerous. She didn't just steal money or damage property. She undermined the credibility of every legitimate victim who truly suffers. Every real single mother struggling to pay rent now faces additional skepticism because of con artists like her. Every person who genuinely faces illegal eviction must work harder to be believed because she weaponized that narrative for profit. Her lie created ripples that extend far beyond the $8,000 she owed Richard Torres. It poisoned the well of trust that society depends on to function. The three principles this case burned into history are these. First, elaborate lies require elaborate maintenance, and eventually the details stop matching. Jessica's story fell apart the moment Judge Judy checked the dates, the timestamps, the paper trail. Truth doesn't need a complicated story because truth is simple and consistent. Second, using sympathy as a weapon destroys it for those who genuinely need it. Jessica's fake tears made it harder for real victims to be heard. That's not just immoral, it's cruel. Third, accountability isn't optional. Jessica thought she could move from victim to victim, county to county, always staying one step ahead. But justice caught up, and when it did, the consequences were total. For Richard Torres, standing in that courtroom was about more than money. It was about his reputation, his character, his refusal to be painted as a villain when he'd done nothing wrong. He could have settled, paid her off, made it go away. Instead, he stood firm, gathered evidence, and let the truth speak. That courage matters because it protects the next potential victim from falling into Jessica's trap. The next time you hear a story that seems designed to manipulate your emotions, remember Jessica Harmon's face when Judge Judy said, "You didn't just lie to me. You lied to every struggling single mother out there." Remember how her elaborate con crumbled in minutes when confronted with facts. Remember that real victims deserve belief, but verification protects everyone. In Judge Judy's courtroom that day, justice didn't just rule on a case. It sent a message that resonates still. Lie in my courtroom and you'll leave with nothing but shame. Tell the truth, and you'll walk out with your dignity intact. Jessica chose the first path, and she'll spend years paying for that choice. Not just in money, but in the reputation she destroyed and the trust she shattered. That's not just a legal consequence. That's a life lesson delivered with the force of a gavel strike, final and unforgettable. So what do you think? Did Jessica get what she deserved, or should the consequences have been even harsher? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I want to hear your take on this. And if you've ever dealt with someone who lied this boldly, share your story below. I read every single comment. If you want more shocking courtroom cases where liars get exposed and justice prevails, click that video on your screen right now where another defendant thought they could fool Judge Judy and paid the ultimate price. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss the moment when truth destroys deception. Remember, lies may run fast, but the truth always catches up. And in Judge Judy's courtroom, the truth doesn't just catch up, it runs you over. See you in the next one.